There's a town in Canada with exactly 5 permanent residents, 500 miles from the North Pole, where the sun doesn't rise for 4 straight months. Another sits completely empty, million-dollar houses and all, kept spotless by a man who bought the whole thing at auction and has never let anyone move back in. And one used to have 2,500 people. Today it has fewer than 30, and most of them will tell you the bar is haunted. Most people think Canada's strangest places are the ones everyone's heard of: Banff, Churchill, maybe Dawson City. They're wrong. Because past the postcard towns, there's a version of this country that barely shows up on a map, let alone a road. Today we're counting down 13 of the weirdest and most isolated towns in Canada that almost nobody talks about. Some got cut off by geography, some got cut off on purpose, and one of them is technically run by a single person who is also its only voter. Subscribe now. Consider it a public service, in case your next road trip accidentally ends somewhere with no cell service and one very confused local. Let's break it down. Number 13, Wayne, Alberta. A narrow valley in the Alberta Badlands, 11 bridges strung across one winding road, and a saloon straight out of 1913. Here's the turn. Wayne used to be a real town, 2,500 people at its peak, built entirely around underground coal mines. The mines started closing in the 1930s, and they kept closing for decades. Today, the population sits under 30. The historic Last Chance Saloon is still open, and so is the Rose Deer Hotel next door, which locals will tell you, without much prompting, is haunted. 11 bridges is an unusual number to build for a town this small, and that's before you learn most of them were built, so miners could cross the creek without getting their boots wet, on a walk to work that no longer exists. What actually gets you isn't the ghost stories, it's the math. A town engineers 11 river crossings for a population that no longer needs even one. Can we talk about how every declining coal town eventually becomes a hidden gem? Somebody closes the mine, and 40 years later, a tourism board rebrands the exact same abandonment as off the beaten path, must see. Picture driving in at golden hour, sandstone hoodoos lit orange on both sides, 11 bridges rattling under your tires, one bar with its lights on at the end of the road. At least Wayne kept its bridges. The next town on this list didn't keep anything. The government simply decided it shouldn't exist anymore. Number 12, Bennett, British Columbia, tucked into the mountains near the Yukon border. No road reaches it. The only ways in are a multi-day hike along the Chilkoot Trail or a heritage narrow-gauge railway. Bennett was never supposed to be permanent. During the Klondike Gold Rush, tens of thousands of prospectors hauled a year of supplies over a mountain pass, then stopped here to build boats for the final push north. For one wild year, Bennett had a population that rivaled a real city, saloons, newspapers, a church still standing today. Then the railway finished in 1900, the boats stopped being necessary, and the town emptied out almost overnight. What's left now is one church, a scattering of foundations, and a stampeder cemetery, people who came thousands of kilometers for gold and never left the lake. Bennett didn't decline. It had exactly one job, did it for about 12 months, and then had nothing left to do. Most towns fade. Bennett finished. Can we talk about how confidently people signed up for the gold rush? Pack a year of food, cross a mountain pass on foot, build your own boat. Sure, sounds fine. Modern use can't assemble furniture without a group chat for support. Imagine standing at that cemetery at dusk, lake perfectly still, one bell tower through the trees, and the reminder that a boomtown can live and die faster than most people's job at a coffee shop. If Bennett proves a town can end almost as fast as it began, the next one never really started at all. It's held together by exactly one person. Number 11, Grise Fjord, Nunavut, the northernmost civilian community in the entire country, home to fewer than 150 people on Ellesmere Island. Here's the turn. Grise Fiord wasn't settled by accident. In the 1950s, the federal government relocated Inuit families here from northern Quebec, partly to assert Arctic sovereignty during the Cold War. Families were told they could return home within a couple of years if they wanted. Many weren't given that choice for decades. Today, residents live through months of total winter darkness, hunt seal and walrus much like their ancestors did, and reach the outside world only by small aircraft or a single annual supply ship. The Inuktitut name for the community translates roughly to the place that never thaws. What makes Grise Fiord unsettling isn't the cold. It's the reason the town exists at all, a government decision that quietly became someone's entire life. Can we talk about how casually history uses the word relocated? It shows up in official records like a minor scheduling note and does an enormous amount of work, hiding an enormous amount of hardship. Picture 4 months without a sunrise, actual total darkness, in a hamlet with a few dozen buildings and one road that goes nowhere in particular. Grise Fiord earned its isolation through history. The next town earned its isolation through geology, one of the strangest landscapes in the country. Number 10. Atlin, British Columbia, often called the most remote town in the province, and it's not close. Atlin sits in BC's far northwest corner, but the only road in runs through the Yukon. There's no cell service on that road, and none in town either. At its gold rush peak in 1898, Atlin had roughly 10,000 people chasing the same fever that built Bennett. Now the population sits somewhere between 300 and 500, depending who's counting. The turn here is the geography itself. Atlin is closer, in almost every practical sense, to Whitehorse in a different territory than to any town in its own province. Provincial services, provincial elections, all technically apply, all functionally distant. Can we talk about how no cell service became a selling point instead of a warning label? 15 years ago, that sentence ended a road trip. Now people drive toward it on purpose. Imagine rolling into Atlin with fresh snow on the mountain behind it, one main street, 0 bars of signal, and the realization the nearest real city isn't even in your own province. If Atlin is technically misplaced, the next town is placed exactly where it should be. It's just that almost nobody else is anywhere near it. Number 9. Old Crow, Yukon, the only community in the entire territory that cannot be reached by road. Not hard to reach. Cannot. The only way in is by small aircraft, year-round. Old Crow sits well above the Arctic Circle on the Porcupine River, home to around 250 people, most belonging to the Vuntut Gwich'in First Nation. The name comes from a Gwich'in chief, whose name translates roughly to Crow, may I walk. Here's the number that lands. Old Crow is also a dry community, no alcohol sold or permitted, in a territory whose reputation runs almost entirely on gold rush saloons and roadhouse bars. Residents still hunt caribou and fish much of their own food, following patterns that predate the country itself. Ice roads connect Old Crow to the world for a few weeks each winter. The rest of the year, it's a plain or nothing. Can we talk about how fly-in only sounds exotic until you remember every grocery run is a flight? Forgot milk? That's not an errand. That's a logistics problem. Picture the Porcupine River at midnight in June, sun still low on the horizon, no roads humming nearby, just water and a town that has done this exact routine longer than Canada has existed. Old Crow chose its isolation on principle. The next town didn't choose anything. It simply got left holding the keys to itself. Number 8. Saxe Harbor, Northwest Territories, the only permanent settlement on all of Banks Island, the 24th largest island on Earth. One village, 70,000 square kilometers of tundra. Population around 90 and shrinking. The turn is the math. That's roughly one resident for every 800 square kilometers of island, when most Canadian cities pack thousands of people into that same footprint. Sax Harbor sits 500 kilometers from Inuvik, the nearest larger community, and most supplies still arrive by air or, briefly in summer, by water. It's above the Arctic Circle, meaning weeks of total winter darkness, followed by weeks of a sun that never fully sets. This isn't a relocated community or a principled holdout. It's simply what's left, a hamlet that once supported more people than it does now, on an island so large that isolated barely covers it. Can we talk about how one small plane cancellation here isn't an inconvenience? It's the only connection to the outside world going dark until the weather clears. No backup flight, no alternate route. Just wait. Imagine standing on Banks Island at 2 a.m. in July, full daylight, absolute silence, and the knowledge that the nearest town in any direction is a plane ride, not a drive. If Sax Harbor is one village managing an entire island, the next town is the opposite problem. Nobody managing it at all, sitting perfectly preserved, waiting for owners who never came back. Number 7, Quetzal, British Columbia. And this one isn't just isolated, it's empty. 90 fully furnished houses, a hospital, a recreation center, a bowling alley. All standing, all maintained, and all completely unoccupied. Quetzal was built in the early 1980s as a molybdenum mining town, funded at enormous expense. The mine closed within about 18 months of opening, and everyone left almost as fast as they'd arrived. Here's the twist. In 2005, an Indian-Canadian businessman bought the entire town, sight unseen, at online auction for roughly $5.7 million. He now reportedly spends over $2 million a year keeping it pristine. Heat runs through the winter. Nobody lives there. A barrier blocks the only road in, and visiting takes advance permission. This is a fully maintained ghost town, kept spotless for reasons its owner has never fully explained. Can we talk about paying millions a year to maintain a town nobody's allowed to live in? That's not a real estate strategy. That's the setup to a mystery novel nobody's written. Picture walking down Quetzal's main street. Furnished homes, working street lights, 0 people, everything ready for a life that stopped happening over 40 years ago. Quetzal is a town preserved on purpose. The next one wasn't preserved at all. It just refuses to disappear. Number 6, Fort Severn, Ontario, the northernmost community in the entire province, sitting on Hudson Bay. And here's the part that surprises people. It's actually further south in latitude than Fort McMurray, Alberta. Fort Severn isn't remote because of how far north it sits. It's remote because of how far everything else is. The nearest year-round road in Ontario ends 450 kilometers away. From there, it's ice roads in winter or a float plane in summer, nothing else. Churchill, Manitoba, one of Canada's most remote towns in its own right, sits over 500 kilometers away in the opposite direction. Fort Severn is more cut off from its own provincial capital than most Canadians are from a different country. Home to a few hundred people, mostly Cree, the community has weathered that isolation for generations through the land, the ice roads, and self-sufficiency. Can we talk about a province that stretches so far it effectively runs out of itself? Same province, an 8-lane highway, and a town that needs a float plane for groceries. Imagine the ice road opening for the season, the one connection this town gets for a few weeks before it melts and the isolation resets. If Fort Severn is isolated by geography nobody planned, the next town made its isolation part of its identity, right down to how you're allowed to get there. Number 5, Hartley Bay, British Columbia, tucked into the Great Bear Rainforest on the province's remote north coast. No road connects it to anywhere. The only way in is by boat or float plane. Home to the Gitga'at First Nation, Hartley Bay has around 150 to 200 residents, and the entire community is built on boardwalks instead of streets. Here's the detail that lands. In 2006, when a ferry sank nearby in the middle of the night, Hartley Bay residents launched their own boats within minutes and pulled nearly 100 people from the water before official rescue crews could arrive. That's the real story of isolation here, not helplessness, the opposite. A community so disconnected from conventional infrastructure that it had to become entirely self-reliant, and that self-reliance saved lives. Can we talk about how remote gets used as a synonym for unprepared? Hartley Bay responded to a maritime disaster faster than most cities with a full harbor authority. Picture boardwalks instead of sidewalks, rainforest pressing in, and boats as the daily commute, not a weekend hobby. Hartley Bay proves isolation can sharpen a community instead of hollowing it out. The next town proves the opposite can happen just as quietly. Number 4, Gioa Haven, Nunavut, on King William Island, where Arctic winds sweep across a landscape that once guided one of the most famous explorers in history. The turn is who came through here first. Norwegian explorer Roald Amundsen wintered his ship in this harbor in the early 1900s while completing the first full navigation of the Northwest Passage, a route explorers had died trying to find for centuries. Gioa Haven takes its name directly from Amundsen's ship, the Gioa. Today, it's home to roughly 1,300 people, most of them Inuit. A genuinely historic breakthrough, one that reshaped how the world understood the Arctic, happened in a place so isolated, most Canadians couldn't find it on a map today. Can we talk about how history keeps its biggest moments in the least visited places? Gioa Haven should be a household name. Instead, it's a hamlet most people learn about from a documentary at 1 a.m. Imagine standing on that shoreline, wind cutting sideways, knowing a wooden ship anchored here for 2 winters while its crew rewrote what was possible in the Arctic. If Gioa Haven is isolation that made history, the next town is isolation that almost erased it completely. Number 3, Nain, the northernmost community in Labrador and the administrative capital of Nunatsiavut, a semi-autonomous Inuit region most Canadians have genuinely never heard of. Nain sits surrounded by fjords and rugged coastline, with no road network to the rest of the province. Roughly 1,200 people live here, relying on air transport and seasonal ferries. Here's the turn. Nunatsiavut is a self-governing Inuit territory with its own government structure. Nain is its capital, the seat of an entire government most Canadians couldn't name. The nearby Torngat Mountains bring in the rare traveler willing to make the trip. For everyone else, Nain functions almost entirely off the national radar, despite being the administrative heart of an actual governing region. Can we talk about how a country can contain a self-governing territory that half its own citizens have never heard mentioned once? That's not a small gap. That's a chapter that got skipped entirely. Picture fjords cutting into the coastline, mountains behind the harbor, and a town quietly running the affairs of a region most maps don't even label clearly. Nain runs a government most people don't know exists. The next town doesn't run anything. It's kept spotless for a purpose nobody's ever explained. Number 2, Tuktoyaktuk, Northwest Territories, on the Arctic coast, and this one has a secret literally underground. At first glance, Tuk looks like most northern hamlets on this list. The turn is what's beneath it. In 1963, residents built a network of tunnels 9 meters straight down into the permafrost, accessed by ladder, to serve as a communal freezer. 19 rooms, most still used to store game meat, kept cold entirely by the permafrost itself. Here's the detail that makes it stranger. In summer, the meat stays properly frozen. In winter, the tunnels can warm up enough that meat has to be pulled out, the opposite of what you'd expect from a hole drilled into Arctic permafrost. The freezer used to draw tourists and was closed to outside visitors in 2016 over safety concerns. Tuktoyaktuk isn't just isolated on the surface, it has an entire second layer underneath it, purpose built by the community to survive conditions almost nowhere else on Earth requires. Can we talk about a town engineering its own refrigerator into the actual planet? Tuktoyaktuk dug 19 rooms into permafrost and figured out a system that's held for over 60 years. Imagine climbing down a metal ladder 9 meters into frozen ground, standing in a room built by hand before most of the country's current infrastructure existed. Tuktoyaktuk built its own solution to isolation. Number 1 on this list didn't need to build anything. It simply refused every reason it had to disappear. Number 1. Alert, Nunavut, 500 miles from the North Pole, the northernmost permanently inhabited place on the planet. Population, 5, not 500, not 50, 5 people, year-round, in temperatures that regularly hit 40 below zero. For 4 months of the year, the sun doesn't rise at all. For another stretch, it never sets. Here's the turn. Alert isn't a town in the traditional sense. It exists almost entirely as a military and research outpost, a place people are stationed, not a place families settle for generations, the way Old Crow or Nain have. Everyone there is there for a reason tied to work, monitoring, research, keeping a Canadian presence at the absolute edge of the map. That's what makes it stranger than every other town on this list. The others are isolated because history relocated people, or geography boxed them in, or an economy dried up and left them behind. Alert is isolated on purpose, permanently, by design. Can we talk about being one of 5 people responsible for an entire settlement at the edge of the planet? No corner store, no neighbor 3 streets over, just 4 other people and several hundred kilometers of ice. Picture the sky at what should be noon, and it's dark, because the sun genuinely isn't coming up for another month. 5 people, 1 outpost, and the entire country going about its Tuesday completely unaware this place exists. That's what ties all 13 of these towns together. Not ghosts, not curses, distance. Some got isolated by history, some by geography, some by an economy that packed up and left, and somehow, every single one of them is still standing, still occupied by somebody, still refusing to fully disappear. If this convinced you Canada has a lot more edges than the map shows, hit like. The algorithm apparently needs to know that no cell service is now a travel incentive for some of you. And subscribe, because next time, we're covering the towns that vanished completely and didn't leave anyone behind to tell us why. See you in the next one.